Hello, my name is Nick Bowman. I'm an associate professor of journalism and creative media industries at Texas Tech University. And I've worked with Tobias and about 3 dozen of your colleagues to try to come up with some solutions or possible action items to address many of the problems Tobias highlighted regarding potential replication crises in the field of communication studies. We recognize that scientific practice in any discipline is always evolving. And one of these evolutions we're seeing in the social sciences broadly, and possibly even in communication studies, is a movement towards open science practices. And we talk about these as a suite of suggestions with the broad aim of making the scientific process more transparent and accessible to others. So, for our authorship team, we spent a lot of time arguing and fighting. We had a very long list, and we finally got it down to 7 manageable and effective practices, hoping to protect the integrity of communication studies as a whole. This list of 7 agenda items is on your screen, and it will be there for the rest of my conversation. As I discuss these 7 items in brief, remember, of course, they're published in detail in our manuscript, which is linked at the bit.ly address on screen. I want you to think about how your research, how your scholarship would be impacted, for better or for worse, if you were to adopt some or all of these recommendations. Our team sees this as an open dialogue that's going to continue both with this panel in the Q&A session, and we hope in the months and years to come. So, the first thing we recommend when we're talking about open science practices is publishing more of your research. Now, here we don't mean simply publishing more manuscripts. What we refer to is publishing more of the bits and pieces of your work that give us insight into the scientific process. This might be your study materials, such as videos or vignettes or stimulus materials. It could be scripts that you gave your research confederates or scripts that you may have used online when you interacted with people, or perhaps it's content analysis code books. These are all things that help people understand the methods that you engaged with your research. We also ask for things that are often seen as a little more owned, such as study data, syntax and code, and data analysis files. These things help people understand the nature of the work that you've done. So when we see a statistical output in a manuscript, we have the accompanying data file and syntax that we can say, oh, that's how this person arrived at this process result. This is something that really helps people get into the nuts and bolts of research. And importantly, the idea here is not just so people can investigate you for fraud, but rather it lets us read deeply into studies so we can understand them more intimately. The more access others have to research, and I mean the nuts and bolts of research, the better we can understand it and replicate it and learn from the work. And so we encourage you to publish more of the pieces of your work whenever possible. We also encourage folks to consider pre-registering their research concepts. And what this refers to is filing their study predictions, their methodologies, your data analyses that are planned, your sampling techniques, and actually filing those in advance of doing the study. Now, you might just do that for yourself, where you just put those somewhere that's timestamped so you know that prior to actually doing the study, you had this analysis plan. One of the nice things about that is it really cuts down on researcher degrees of freedom. Quite simply, it cuts down on our sort of innate desire to kind of sift through the weeds or sift through the data to find patterns that maybe we weren't looking for in the beginning, which can lead to some of the questionable research practices that Tobias is talking about. Importantly, this does not mean you cannot explore your data. What we're referring to is making clear delineations between the a priori predictions and the post hoc explorations that you might be engaging in. One of the ways that pre-registration can really be useful as part of maybe your normal scientific process is by doing registered reports. And this is when you take those pre-registered predictions, methods, analyses, and you actually send them to a journal before you do the study itself. The materials are reviewed by, peer reviewers, by editors, and you get feedback. You can get formative feedback about the research. I mean, nothing's more frustrating than doing a study and then you find out from reviewer 2 that they don't like the way you manipulated something and you can't do anything about it. One of the neat things about registered reports is that journals have the option of accepting your work in principle. And what that means is they essentially guarantee to publish the work independent of the results. This ensures the work is being evaluated based on its scientific design and not the results, which sometimes, good results might make a study that's a bit questionable seem more exciting. This might be a particularly attractive option during the current global situation, where a lot of our research activities have kind of been brought to a halt. We also encourage more engagement with replication studies, and this is taking existing research, right, and making sure that it still holds up. There's a lot of important scholarship and communication that's never really been replicated. So, we have a finding that might be 10 or 20 years old, and we just accept it and move on. And we want to know if that scholarship still holds up over time, right? We want to know if maybe there's been important changes in a phenomenon that might lead us to expect that that finding would not replicate over time. Um, Basically, we're asking folks to question what we think we already know. And again, here, it's not attacking our colleagues for doing research and being suspicious of it holding up. It's more that, science evolves, and we want to make sure that we're evolving on a tough foundation, on a strong foundation. Replication projects can be really attractive work for graduate student projects, especially when you're training or you yourself are going through training where you're still learning some of the basics of research. Because in a replication project, of course, a lot of those basics are already established for you. And it's an opportunity to kind of practice doing the work before having to craft an entire project to the side. So we definitely encourage individuals to reconsider the importance of replications, whether those are directly replicating somebody's methods or replicating them in different contexts and things of this nature. You'll notice that collaboration is our fourth agenda item. And here it might seem a bit weird that collaboration would be an open science practice. And one of the reasons that we argue it could be is that collaborations do a couple of things for us. First, they allow us to have, different shareholders who can be checking our work and going back and forth. They allow us the ability to do almost immediate planned replications, right? If you do a study in one location, you can now take that study and put it in several different locations to see if your findings are holding up. They also allow us to pool our resources to combat some of the issues with underpowered studies that we often have in a field like communication studies, which doesn't typically have very strong expected effect sizes. And so we encourage folks to work in teams to see if they can't counteract some of the weaknesses Tobias mentioned earlier. Some of the resistance to open science practices really comes from a lack of training. In fact, the majority of the authors on this manuscript received no formal training in open science practices. We learned it by listening to other folks talk about it, reading editorials, hearing about it through, news coverage and things like this. And we might need to open ourselves up to some, continued learning. And this goes for your entry-level graduate students and early career scholars to your established scholars and editors like myself who had to grapple with open science as I started reviewing manuscripts for publication. Our manuscript provides several of these open access resources, and we would definitely encourage you. And just as a reminder, we're always learning new theory and new methods and new ways of gathering and analyzing data. And open science really shouldn't be any different in terms of, evolving our norms and improving our science as we go along. For number 6, we're really speaking to journals to adopt the transparency and openness promotion guidelines. This is an encouragement on the behalf of journals to take a leading role in encouraging and insisting scholars to engage open science practices. We recognize that publications are one of the gold currencies of science. So if the journals are there to help us work through these issues, whether it's by incentivizing open science manuscripts or whether it's by providing the open science spaces or the training itself, One of the ways the journals can do this is they can also calibrate the open science practices relative to their field, right? So some disciplines may naturally not be very well equipped for example, sharing sensitive data, but the journals in those fields can help make those calibration points. And our general concept here is if we work with the journals to encourage open science practices, that naturally trickles down to the scientists publishing in those journals. And on that note, our seventh point is to also speak to academic associations, tenure and promotion committees, grant authorities, individuals who have hiring, responsibilities should also take a role in recognizing the value of open science and recognizing that it's something that should be celebrated or at least encouraged. We've heard people talk about how they're worried about publishing too much of their research because it might hurt their tenure cases or they don't want to be attacked and things of this nature. And we like to take the opportunity to encourage folks that are involved in those evaluations to maybe consider that open science practices can help us lead to better scholarship. In fact, we do know that there are several grant agencies, particularly in Europe, that are requiring open science practices. That if you don't have sort of a valorization component of your work that involves sharing data and resources, that you may not get funding at all. So there already are some movements in this direction. And sort of with the journals, we recognize that the journals and the academic institutions are power brokers in our field, but they can also compel us to evolve our scientific norms. So here in a moment, you're going to be invited to another video with myself and Tobias and established scholars and early career scholars and journal editors. And we're all going to talk about this agenda and how it's affecting us in good ways and in concerning ways. And likewise, in our manuscript, we spend a lot of time on sort of the pros and cons of open science. We recognize that there are substantial implications for some of the things we're suggesting, and we want to talk more soberly about those recommendations. But we do contend, after a lot of debate with, again, myself and Tobias and about 36 of your colleagues, scientific norms must always evolve if we want to ensure that the work we do today holds value tomorrow. So thank you for listening, and I'll see you online.